Good evening. Welcome to the April 1st, 2019 Parks and Natural Resource Commission agenda. Tonight we're going to start out with approval of agenda. Commissioners, staff, do you have any comments, additions to the agenda?
Nothing from staff.
Can I get a motion to
So
move on? Second?
Aye.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, let's move on to the approval of the minutes. Commissioners and staff, do you have any comments or changes?
Madam Chair, I'd just like to point out that the minutes were omitted from your packet. We will have them available online tomorrow if anyone wishing to review those minutes was looking for them. So they will be available online tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Next we will, I need to get a motion to move on.
Please.
So move.
Second?
Aye.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, then we will look to the audience for some citizen comments. Being none, we'll move on to our first presentation of the evening. We're going to look at a review of the 2018 Prescribed Grazing Project and the proposed Ordinance Amendment. And we will be having a presentation from Caleb, our Natural Resource Specialist.
All right. Well, thank you, Commissioners, for having me tonight. As you already kind of mentioned, I've got a two-part presentation tonight. The first part is going to be a review of the first year of the pilot project with prescribed grazing or goat grazing for habitat management. And then the second part of my presentation is going to be going over a proposed ordinance and policy related to prescribed grazing in Burnsville. So just a quick overview of the pilot project. So some commissioners may be familiar with it, but we did our first pilot project using goats to control buckthorn and do habitat management. The project was done here at Civic Center Park, and we started it in 2018. The project size of the area was 2.2 acres. It was allowed by special city council approval. So it normally wouldn't be allowed under ordinance, so we did have special approval to do the project. And we had 17 goats that grazed the area from September 19th to October 4th. So that's kind of a quick overview, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into the project, some of the background, and then the results that we saw from it. Goats are fun to talk about. Everybody is excited about goats, but I'd like to remind people that the prescribed grazing is really about not just the goats, but about habitat management. So what we're trying to do out there is oak savanna restoration. And this is an overview of the project area from 2016 from aerial photos. This is just a little bit south and east of City Hall here. So the red line outlines the project area. And if you look closely at this photo, you can see that this area is pretty much completely tree covered. There's a lot of weedier trees in there like box elders, and then the understory is almost all common buckthorn, which is an invasive plant species that's bad for our woodland areas. Then if you look back at 1951, so this is an aerial photo of that same area. You can see that the landscape around City Hall here has changed quite a bit. So if you look at the project area, there's some dark circles there. Those are specific trees, and then in between those trees you can see that it's a fairly open or a more open landscape, so much more savanna-like at that time. So what we're trying to do is kind of restore some of those savanna conditions to the area. So with this project, our goals are similar to a lot of the other habitat restoration that we do here in town. We're trying to control buckthorn along with some of those weedier trees, restore native grasses and wildflowers, that encourage the regeneration of oak seedlings that will help replace some of our older oak trees over time. But then along with it, we have this other component of evaluating goats as a control method for doing habitat management. So we have numerous tools available to us already, like using herbicide, brush cutting, mowing, or using prescribed burns. So we would like to evaluate, is prescribed grazing with goats one of those tools that we want to have in our toolbox for land management, and then what's the best way to use it? So why goats, other than they're cute and fun? Goats have the ability to potentially allow us to reduce our herbicide use. So herbicide is an important tool in habitat management, so we're never going to probably eliminate it, but if we can find ways to reduce it, that is a positive thing. Goats allow some ability to remove some nutrients from the system. So goats are eating vegetation, they're using that vegetation to produce their own energy. So it allows some level of nutrient removal, and sometimes high nutrients in soil or the aquatic environment have been correlated with invasive species issues. They can draw attention to land management. So it's never a primary purpose to use goats to draw attention, but if we can do other good work while bringing people's attention to buckthorn, that is a positive thing. And another benefit can be their ability to be used on steep slopes where we might not be able to use other types of equipment. We chose a location here at City Hall that was very visible, close to local schools, and made a nice demonstration area, but we could apply them in other areas where the terrain is very difficult. So the goats were not the first step of this project. There were several steps before we got to bringing the goats on the landscape. So our first step happened in March of last year. We had a prison work crew that helped us remove buckthorn and some of those smaller, weedier tree species that could be removed with hand tools. And the goal of that was really to encourage understory vegetation growth by opening the area up to more sunlight, and then create some of those openings for oak seedlings. So this is a picture of the project area before we did any removals of buckthorn or other vegetation. And this is a picture after those initial removals. So you can see a lot of work was done to try to open this area up quite a bit. This is a picture of the same area in summer of last year. So still looking pretty nice and open. But if you look closely, there's an understory of almost all young buckthorn that's coming back into the area. So once you remove the bigger buckthorn, there's going to be a ton of seeds that pop up, and that buckthorn will try to take back over. And that's kind of the part where we try to bring in the goats to control that smaller buckthorn. So our second step of the project happened in May of last year. We seeded the area with native grasses and cover crop. And the idea behind that was we want something to get established early to compete with the buckthorn, so it's not the only thing growing there. And then those grasses, once established, can provide us some additional fuel for prescribed burns. So the year-to-year die-off of the grasses provides a thatch layer, and we can use that to carry prescribed burns that can help us with our management plan. And step 3 is to bring on the goats to the area. So that happened in fall of last year. So mid-September, our contractor brought on the goats. This is a contract company that specializes in doing prescribed grazing with goats. We started with 8 goats in the area, ended up with 17, and as I mentioned, they were out there for around 2 weeks or so. So when the goats got to the site, this is kind of a diagram of what the conditions were like here. As I mentioned, we had a lot of that smaller buckthorn, the buckthorn saplings that were covering the area, 2 to 4 foot tall or so. And then we did have native grass seedlings underneath from the seeds that we had planted earlier in the year. So that buckthorn is creating shade. That's shading out some of those seedlings that we're trying to establish. It's also providing root competition for some of that other type of vegetation that we want to grow. So kind of the idea is we bring on our goats, my fancy animation here. The goats move through the area, they browse on the vegetation, they strip the buckthorn and other plants, larger plants of green vegetation. They chew on some of the branches. That's going to open the area up for more sunlight to reach the ground. It's also, by impacting the buckthorn, it's going to cause some root dieback that's going to allow some more resources for some of those plants that we're trying to establish. So we're setting it back, trying to promote conditions that are good for those understory plants. So that's kind of the theory and the background behind the goals. So moving on to kind of what we saw them doing when they were out there. So they definitely ate buckthorn from about the first 10 seconds after they stepped off the truck. They were eating, and they didn't stop very often until they left the site. So they're definitely big eaters, and they cover a lot of ground pretty fast. So as I mentioned, we cleared almost all the project area of the larger buckthorn. We did leave a little bit in a small back corner just to kind of see what they would do with that. Once they covered the smaller buckthorn, the saplings, they did girdle the bark off some of the larger buckthorn. That's kind of what you're seeing in this photo here, is where they chewed the bark off the buckthorn. They also had a little bit of time to hang out with a local celebrity here in town. You may or may not be familiar with Sustainability Man. The Sustainability Man produces some educational videos about the environment for us here in Burnsville. So the goats and the goat wrangler had a chance to do some of those educational videos. Then the goats also got a chance to hang out with a couple local school classes while they were here in town. So one thing we really were hoping for with this pilot project was, because of its it being adjacent to 2 local elementary schools, that we'd be able to get some kids out there. So we got one 5th grade class from each of the adjacent elementary schools that were able to walk to the site, do a little meet and greet with the goats, learn about buckthorn, and of course everyone loved getting a chance to feed the goats some buckthorn as well. So that was a really fun project and seemed to be really enjoyed by the kids as well. All right, so of course after we went through the first year with that, a big question from a lot of folks was, did it work? So I'll start by looking at some before and after photos from the project. So this is a before photo. If you want to look, there's kind of a unique bendy tree here on the left side. That tree will be in the next photo as well. This was taken just a week or 2 before the goats came into the site last fall.
Wow.
So this is that same project area. You can see the same tree there after the goats went through. So they did a really good job of stripping all the green material off the buckthorn that was on the site, and some of the other vegetation that was mixed in there as well. And you can make out a little bit of green underneath. Some of that was the grass seedlings that we had coming in. This is just another example here. So this is a before photo. It's another after photo after the goats went through. And then one final before and after photo here, looking towards the ice arena in the background there. They definitely did a good job of eating the vegetation on the site, and they were able to work through it relatively quickly in that 2-week time period. So did it work? There's kind of 2 ways we look at this. The first is kind of on that 1-year evaluation basis, which is kind of what I'm here to talk about tonight. On that 1-year basis, yes, they did what we were hoping for. As you can see from the before and after photos, they defoliated the buckthorn out there, the other vegetation, so they did a good job of impacting that. We are seeing the seedling grasses start to establish on the site, so that's another positive sign from the project. And there did seem to be a lot of interest from the public as well in the project, and also an opportunity for a lot of people to learn about buckthorn through this project. And then the other part of this is looking at it in a more long-term basis, and whether it's going to work in the long term. And the answer to that, I think at this point still is maybe. So this is a 3-year pilot project, and we've only done the 1 year, so we need some more time to evaluate it and see how it's going to work after the 3-year pilot period. And then some of the questions that we still have with this is, how fast is the buckthorn going to respond? So we know that stripping the buckthorn of its vegetation isn't going to kill it, it's going to impact it, and hopefully through some of our techniques of providing competition, opening the area up for some more sunlight, we can help to convert the habitat to more of what we want, but we know that will take some time. And other questions are, how often would grazing be required to get the changes that we want? And what are some of the benefits versus the cost of using goats versus some of the other methods that we have? available to us. So what's next for this pilot project? So we plan on continuing with the 3-year pilot project as approved already through City Council. And we're planning on having the goats come back from mid-May of this year approximately through early June, kind of in that time window. The idea being that when the buckthorn leafs back out, we want to try to hit it right away and give it not a lot of chance to replenish any energy. And then the second part of that is we'd like to review and consider an ordinance change and associated policy related to prescribed grazing here in Burnsville.
Caleb, before you go on to that,
Sure.
when the buckthorn comes back this spring, would it be more amenable to the goats eating more of the stem of the plant and not just the leaves?
I think they'll still primarily target the leaves. So since the buckthorn is smaller, the branches are, those saplings are fairly small and bendable. It's hard for them to really chew the branches when they're smaller like that. So they target more of the green leaves and the bark and at that smaller stage. Any other questions?
Yeah, so when you cut buckthorn, it responds pretty vigorously, and a lot of times it will really, it realizes it's being stressed, and it'll also be more likely to be a seed producer in a shorter period of time.
Yep.
So I'm assuming that's something that you'll be watching for over this 3-year period to see what that response is, because there's still a ton of seed, I'm sure, in that seed bank. It doesn't all get exhausted in a single year. And so I'm assuming that you're going to be really watching for that, because I've seen too much stuff. I've seen too much buckthorn cut, and the following year we've got really rapid response from cut or mowed buckthorn, and then very vigorous seed production. So.
Yeah, that definitely is something that we'll be watching for. As was mentioned, buckthorn, if it's not been cut before, it usually doesn't produce seed until much later, but if it's been cut, then it produces seed at a shorter height, even a couple feet tall. We'll see how the goats respond to that. From talking to our contractor, it sounds like they actually love the berries and eat them. And I don't know if there's been any scientific studies, but supposedly the goat digestive system can break down some of those berries and make them not viable. But that is something we will have to see, and we'll definitely be watching for.
Any the goat managers worried about any of the laxative effects of the buckthorn berries?
I don't think so. So, from what I've heard, goats are pretty tough. Supposedly, they eat poison ivy and a variety of other things, so they can handle a lot. All right. Yeah, I will move on to the second part of my presentation here, which is talking about a proposed ordinance and associated ordinance amendment and associated policy related to prescribed grazing. So currently in Burnsville, prescribed grazing is not allowed except potentially in an extreme southwest Burnsville in an area zoned rural residential where people can have some other types of livestock. But in the vast majority of Burnsville, it would not be allowed under current ordinance. So this is addressing that and potentially making or proposing to make it allowable in certain specific situations. So I like to emphasize when we're talking about this, or I worry a little bit that if people hear about this, they'll think that this means we'll have a goat on every corner in town, which I've tried to illustrate a little bit here. And that is not what we're talking about. Prescribed grazing is a specific land management tool. It's not goats for pets, and it's not goats for petting zoos. This is a specific land management tool in situations where it is needed. So I'd just like to emphasize that part of it. We have had some public interest in an ordinance change related to goats. So there's been more discussion in the news the last 5-6 years related to goats and other agencies that have been using them. So we've started to hear more from residents who are interested in what the city's policies are. And then we did get a specific request last year from a business actually that wanted us to review and consider changing our ordinance to allow them to use prescribed grazing. So just an example of the types of places that we've heard from that might be interested in prescribed grazing. So the business, this is the one I mentioned that was interested in an ordinance change, has multiple acres. They have an existing fence in place for security. They have an environmental group, an initiative that's looking at trying to do land management and buckthorn removal. And they felt that prescribed grazing may be a good fit for them. And then also, sort of as an example, a 2-acre area down in southwest Burnsville. We have a number of areas in southwest Burnsville that have larger lots. A lot of those larger lots have quite a bit of buckthorn if the area isn't managed. And we've heard from some folks down there that are interested as well. So if we have an ordinance here in town, we wouldn't be the first ones. There is ordinances in other cities that are specific to prescribed grazing already. Faribault was probably the first one to pass their ordinance. Egan passed the prescribed grazing ordinance 2 or 3 years ago. The city of Bloomington last year. And then some other cities have used goats without a specific ordinance related to them. And we've been in talks and based a lot of our proposed ordinance and policy off some of these other cities and what they've done. So there's kind of two parts of this ordinance, or what we're proposing today. The first is an ordinance amendment to the animal section of the code that adds an exception to allow prescribed grazing. So currently, the animal section of city code lists some animals that are allowed, dogs, cats, that type of thing, and says other types of animals aren't allowed. And there's already one exception. We'd like to add a second exception within that code section specific to prescribed grazing. And then we're also proposing a policy that lays out the specific rules of who can do the grazing, where, how many goats can be there, how long they can be there, and those types of details. All right, so this is some of the actual ordinance text that we're proposing. So as I mentioned in the animal section of the code, Chapter 6, Section 2, there's an area that specifies which animals are allowed and generally has a blanket statement that other types of animals aren't allowed. There is an exception already for the area extreme southwest Burnsville, that's rural residential for some of those more livestock animals. That's exception A on the screen here. And then we're proposing to add an exception B, which you'll see as the second paragraph here. And that section would state that a contractor who has obtained a prescribed grazing permit from the city may use prescribed grazing with approved grazing animals on specified property in the city for a defined period for the express purpose of controlling invasive, noxious, or unwanted vegetation. Kind of a long sentence there, but gets the point across. So we're looking at making prescribed grazing allowed, so it's specifying the situation and who can do the prescribed grazing. And then within the section of code, we'd also be adding 2 definitions. One definition would be defining prescribed grazing as using approved grazing animals, which in the policy would identify those as goats, as a landscape management technique to control noxious, invasive, or other unwanted vegetation at a specified location and for a defined length of time. Then the second definition we'd be adding would be defining a prescribed grazing permit as a permit annually issued that allows prescribed grazing within city limits. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit here. So that would be the mechanism within city code that would allow prescribed grazing. The ordinance amendment and then those definitions. And then within that, it would be regulated through a policy that would also be passed, or we propose would be passed by City Council. The policy would provide an outline for the purpose or need, the specific rules that would regulate prescribed grazing, and then the procedure for regulating the policy. So the policy was included in your background, and I won't cover every single piece of it, because there's a little bit quite a bit of information in there, but I'll try to hit on the main important points of it. So the first point, which is already kind of emphasized, is that there must be a need to do the work. There must be invasive or noxious vegetation present to do prescribed grazing. So there has to be a need to have the animals out there. And then a permitted contractor must be hired. So we want to work with the contractors and work with them closely to make sure they're aware and following all our requirements. So the contractors, if they want to work within Burnsville, they'd have to apply for an annual permit. They'd have to show us their insurance requirements, and we'd be requiring a high insurance limit along with that for any issues that may come up. We'd have notification requirements where the contractor must notify the city 10 days before they're coming into town and also on the day that they arrive with the goats for a project. Then there'd be emergency contact requirements as well. So, and they're familiar with that. They have to provide contact information for someone who's available 24 hours a day to deal with any issues that could come up. Then on their application, the contractor would have to read through our policy, sign their name on it, and say that they agree to follow all our rules. And we think working closely with these contractors is the best way to go. It'll make it a little bit easier for residents who are interested, because they don't have to know everything in the code. It's the contractor that's going to have to know all those rules within the code. And because there's only a handful of companies out there, it makes it fairly easy for the city to work with them in this way. So the policy would also state that prescribed grazing would be allowed on parcels that are a half acre or greater in size. So parcels that are larger than your average lot. So smaller parcels have some easier tools available to them to manage buckthorn, manual removal, that type of thing. It gets a little bit harder for property owners once they get into that larger lot size to manage their land, and where prescribed grazing could be a useful tool for them. Then the exception to that is multiple parcels could work together if they have a total grazing area of a half acre. That's not specific to the parcel size, it'd be the actual area to be grazed. Then grazing cannot occur more than twice within a calendar year, and the grazing event would have to be 30 days or less. And then as far as how many animals could be on a project, the herd size couldn't exceed 2 goats per every 1/10 acre of enclosed grazing area. So just for an example of what that could mean, so if we have a property that has about 3/4 acre, some of that land's going to be house, driveway, turf grass. They may have 3/10 of an area that they'd actually, they have buckthorn, and then that they want to graze. That would mean they could use 6 goats on their property. Then fencing requirements. So with these types of projects, temporary fencing is standard, and that's what contractors are using most of the time for these types of projects. And that's what we use at Civic Center here as well. And this is a photo from our project here in Burnsville. Energized fencing is allowed with this proposed policy. It would have to be part of a 2-part fence system where the outer row of fencing is non-energized, keeping people away from the energized fence, and then the inner fence could be energized. Or if people were going to have the fencing back from a property line, at least 30 feet, then they could use a single line of energized fence. Then within our policy, we also state the types of energized fencing that can be used. So people think of energized or electric fence kind of as the old weed burner fence. What's being used in these situations is quite a bit different. So we're specifying that a low impedance energizer has to power the fencing system, and it uses a short pulse of electricity, so it's 3/10,000ths of a second. So a very short duration pulse that's separated by 1 second in between the pulses. So compared to those old style electric fences, which were more continuous electricity flowing, it's very low risk. I touched one myself. There's a little zap. Reactively, you just pull away from it. and there really isn't much of an issue. So contractors have been using these for quite a long time, and they've had not really any issues with the public coming into contact with them. Then the permits for the contractors could be revoked for any violation of policy. So some of those violations could be failure to notify the city if they were coming into town, failure to respond to any issues that developed that were reported by the public or city staff, creation of anything that was considered a public nuisance, or failure to adhere to any of our policy guidelines. So we've worked into this policy some mechanisms that allow us to regulate it, and if there's any issues occurring, we can revoke the permit for the contractor, and then they'd have to remove the animals from the site. And with that, so what I'll be requesting is a motion to recommend City Council approval of the Ordinance Amendment and Policy, and also be taking questions or any suggestions related to it.
Okay, Commissioners, I'd have a curious question. Are the goats actually there 24/7 for 30 days, or do they go home at night?
They're there the full time. The actual duration of the project would depend on how big the area was. So for example, our project for 2.2 acres was only 2 weeks. So smaller sites might be done even faster.
Okay.
So that's just the maximum. But for whatever project they're on, they're gonna be there 24 hours a day. So they sleep out under the stars, and they're used to that.
Did you have any escapes?
We did not, no.
Good.
You provide water for them?
The contractor does, or sometimes they work it in with the homeowners if it's a private property that the homeowners can provide it.
Any other questions or comments from the Commissioners?
I have a question. So why are we, just from my knowledge perspective, why are we just asking for twice a year things versus more? The limitation? I'm sure there's a reason behind that, so I just want to.
Yeah, yep, the twice a year aspect of it is, because we are a developed environment, we feel that the situations that the guidelines that we've laid out are adequate for getting land management control of buckthorn and other species. But we want to make sure that goats aren't out on the landscape all the time, where we could potentially develop situations where we're more likely to get a complaint from adjacent areas.
Okay.
So if we allowed more often, we might be more likely to have situations where people were not happy to have them around as much.
Thank you.
I have a suggestion for, on the first page of the prescribed use grazing for land management. The rationale is prescribed grazing is intended to provide an alternative to the use of chemicals as a means of control of undesired vegetation. I think that's I think you should add cutting and mowing. You should add the whole suite in your toolkit as opposed to just say it's about chemicals. Mm-hmm. I think that's also, if there was biocontrol, I would add that in. There isn't a biocontrol right now available for buckthorn. I don't think they're gonna find one, so, but I definitely include mowing and cutting and other mechanical means in the language of the ordinance, because, it's more than just an alternative to herbicide.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Proposing more, it's its own specific management tool, similar to mowing and those other techniques. Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other comments? Okay, it looks like we are ready to make a motion to, should we do it separately, the ordinance and the amendment, or together, or does it matter?
I think together would be all right.
Okay, let's make a motion to approve a prescribed grazing ordinance amendment and policy.
Second?
Okay, a second.
Second, sorry.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, next we'll move on to the next item on our agenda. We're gonna hear about a couple new park designs from Garrett. We're gonna hear about the Red Oak Park design and the Cedarbridge Park design.
All right, good evening, Commissioners. I'm gonna have to talk to JJ about putting me up after goats because that's a tough act to follow, but I do believe we've got some pretty exciting projects here that, may not be quite at the goat level, but, actually, I think the second one is pretty, a great opportunity for our community. But, tonight you're gonna be hearing two different presentations from me. One is really for informational purposes to kind of talk about how we manage through the Cedarbridge Playground replacement project. And then the second one is kind of new information that only in the last month we have an opportunity before us that now that it's come to fruition, I'd like to bring you guys up to speed and let you know what we're working on and what lies ahead. So we'll start out with Cedarbridge. We'll go through a history, talk about a neighborhood survey that we completed. We ended up bringing in a consultant, and we'll share their results. And then ultimately, we did a concept design with the consultant and submitted a playground RFP that had some results, and then kind of how we use that process to get where we are currently. So first, I'd like to start out simply just by talking about the importance of playgrounds in our park system. Research continues to show that the playground itself is a very valuable part of a park, and specifically it helps children with improving brain development opportunities. We have children exposed to different development of social skill opportunities as they manage their time with other kids, maybe wanting to use the same slide at the time they do, and things like that. Just as importantly, it encourages parents to get outside with their kids and get away from technology and being inside and being on their devices. And then another similar type thing is by getting outside and going to playgrounds, they're going to be involved in physical activity. You hear in the news over and over again how obesity in the United States continues to be a problem, and this is just one of the great things that we can offer in our parks to help combat that. And then, of course, it's a community gathering space where people are getting out and meeting their neighbors and engaging with other people in the community that live and play and work around them. Cedarbridge, specifically, this playground, you can see here is a picture of it in the upper left corner. It's over 23 years old, and we typically have at about that 20-year or a little after 20-year, our playgrounds go through a replacement process. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Cedarbridge Park as a whole, but it's a very unique park. This isn't the greatest picture on the bottom here, but you can kind of see Cedarbridge is on a hill for the most part. So this volleyball court that you see is kind of over to the left side of the sign here, and then you have a wooded area in this area, and then you have this hill which tucked behind the trees is where you see the playground that's pictured right here, and then even further up the hill, but not pictured because it's not part of this, is actually a basketball court. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of challenges with accessibility with the way this park was laid out, and there's just a number of different challenges. So as this came up in 2018 and we started looking at it, just doing a basic playground replacement just didn't make a lot of sense, given some of the obvious challenges that seem to exist in this park. So the first thing we decided to do was go ahead and do a neighborhood survey. We reached out to our standard process of how far we will go out and send out letters to the neighborhood just saying, hey, we're scheduled to do a replacement of the playground in your neighborhood, and we'd just like to know more about what you think about your park in general, and so please provide feedback. And it was great to see. We ended up having 65 households reply back to us in the survey, and they kind of validated the importance of the playground in that it was the #1 amenity that they valued the most in the park. And we did ask them about the frequency of use and what amenities did they like about the park, and then also just kind of gauged what did they want to see as this park evolves, both this year and in years to come, as we try to address some of the challenges there. So, as related to the playground itself, they had the opportunity to just kind of randomly supply information to us that wasn't related to a specific question, and we saw things like a variety of play. Currently, that park does not have a swing set, and that came up multiple times. Some type of adventure play, and then improving the accessibility and the sightlines came out over and over again. People just didn't necessarily feel safe having their kids tucked behind the trees and not being able to see from the road and things like that. So with all these concerns and the uniqueness of this particular park, we brought Confluence in. Again, Confluence, you may recognize their name. They were part of our 2017 Parks and Recreation System Master Plan, so they are familiar with our park system. They've worked with our community before, and it was just an easy thing to bring them in, let them take a look at the park. We provided them the feedback from the survey, so they had a chance to read through that, and then also send their staff out to the park and take a look at it just to see if there's anything that we might be missing, or that they've experienced in other projects that they did that we might want to consider at Cedarbridge. At the end of the day, they did a lot of confirming of what some of our thoughts were, and what the neighborhood talked about, and that yes, the playground was not in the right place. First and foremost, with ADA accessibility being a primary thing that we want to have front and center as we're doing new projects and replacements. Really the only way possible, given the budget that we had to work with, was to move that location down closer to the existing sidewalk and street. In addition, that solved the sight lines and visibility challenges associated with where the playground currently was. And so ultimately their design that they provided us with kind of showed how you can solve some of those challenges. The downside of this was the removal of the volleyball court. That was something that the neighborhood had an interest in many years ago, but through the survey, there were a few responders that indicated that the volleyball court was something they would like to see stay, but over and over again, it also came out that the volleyball court isn't used, and that space could be better used for other things. So through all that, this was a conceptual design that we were provided with, and from there we were able to take this design and share it with with the playground equipment providers that exist in the state of Minnesota. So just as an FYI, our playground request for proposal process has been pretty standard for several years. We use a best value approach, and what we do is we basically, in the RFP, will say the city has this much money for the equipment, for the container, for the resilient materials and things like that, and it's kind of a turnkey process. So give us your best design and let us take a look at it, and then some type of group will then evaluate the different proposals that we receive and make a decision on selecting a provider to come in and do the project. In this particular case, we did have 5 responses to the RFP, which is pretty standard for us. And so instead of, certainly staff reviewed the designs and we had our favorite, but we used the neighborhood as part of this process from day one. So we shared the different designs with the 65 people that filled out our survey in the first place, and just allowed them to let us know what they think. And it was nice to see there were 5 great responses. 2 of them kind of rose to the top, and it would have been a challenge to try to vote. So it was kind of nice to see that the neighborhood had a clear-cut winner on what they liked out of the 5 designs. And this is what we are looking at putting into Cedarbridge as a replacement to what was there in that previous picture. So I'll just walk through this real quickly. They talked about adventure play type things, and one of the most exciting things, I think maybe what sold it and kind of what you're seeing popping up in playgrounds, is this zip line that goes on the bottom here. Here's a side shot of it in this picture right here. And these are in some of our neighboring community parks, and just in discussions and having seen them personally, they're always used by kids, and they're just a lot of fun. So it's going to be a great addition to this particular neighborhood in this park. You can see we got the swings in as a nice piece that was not there, and they're always popular at playgrounds. This is a great piece that is kind of unique and new. You can see maybe in this picture here, but it's kind of like a merry-go-round, ADA accessible, and I've seen them in use, and you'll see everybody on them using them all the time with the spinners and things like that. And then you have, your traditional tower with, we have 4 different slides on here based on different levels and opportunities for climbing and things like that. Monkey bars, your traditional things that are always a hit, and then we have a spinner over here on the edge. So with the budget that we had to work with and having to remove the playground and relocate it and take out a lot of times we don't have to do as much land prep when we're dealing with just a playground replacement, because we're doing it within the same container. I couldn't be happier to see the project that we were able to come up with for the money that we had to work with. So as of now, this is, we took care of all the paperwork and everything, and we're kind of waiting for spring. We're looking at an April start with a hope that it would be finished in May. So that's an update on Cedarbridge. Questions, comments, concerns?
In the other diagram, you had a sliding hill.
Yeah.
Is there some kind of barrier at the bottom to keep people from sliding into the street?
So, in this particular, back in this park, I think we identified a number of challenges associated with it. One of the challenges itself was the volleyball court and how it had deteriorated in condition and some other things. So that challenge itself is going to be taken care of with this project as we move the playground down there. The other one was the playground and location. That's going to be solved. We still have a challenge with that's not part of this particular project with the sledding hill itself, and it is used, and there were many comments about, is there a possibility to put up a berm and things like that. And then, the additional challenge of the basketball court being at the top of the hill, and what does that mean? And I don't know about you guys, but when I play basketball, mine don't always go in every time, and so you have a ball go off the rim and down the hill it goes, and where does it end up but out in the street? Not to mention we have a bike rack that's halfway up the hill, which is kind of odd too. So we have multiple challenges in the park that have been there with a lot of opportunity to make some improvements over time with them as budget allows.
So, can you go back to the last slide?
Yeah.
How far is this thing from the road? And do we have, I think we have talked about the barrier, because we had a similar kind of situation at Nicollet Con Park, that kids were coming in, or if they are throwing and they're throwing balls, they will run.
Yeah.
So have we considered something, maybe not now, but going forward, so the little kids cannot just go and then run to the road?
So you, in this design, you can kind of see from from the concept design, is that we're gonna come in, this is the higher side of the road and whatnot, so we're for sure, I don't know if we're gonna have the slope of this, I'm not guaranteeing that that's going to be in this, but we're gonna be coming in with an accessible surface into the playground up the hill here. So it's going to get us, as you can see where the sidewalk is, we're gonna be working in up to this general area is gonna be where the playground goes, which is where the volleyball court is right now. So I can't tell you what the distance is from this edge down to the sidewalk, but it's pretty significant where it's not just right up against the road. So, but I think you're right, we'll have to monitor that and see what type of fencing and whatnot may be required in that area once we see how it gets in and what the neighborhood thinks, so.
Depends on how, again, and I'm very fiscally conservative, so it's not that we have to do it depending on how much use it goes. There's a lot of factors that will go into it. But maybe the future thing that we have to look at.
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Commissioners, I think it's important to point out that this is a neighborhood park, and so this road does not have the same amount of
Oh, it
traffic
doesn't.
on it
Okay.
that
It's Nicollet.
Nicollet Avenue
Okay.
has and things like that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for pointing out.
Any other comments or questions?
Yep.
So the next playground I get to talk about is what's going on in Red Oak Park. We've had the opportunity, and I've been here for 20-some years, and had an opportunity to be a part of a lot of projects, and I'm not sure that my excitement level has been any greater than what this opportunity means for Burnsville and our park system and things like that. So hopefully I don't ruin the whole presentation by sharing that ahead of time, because you may not feel the same, but there's just a lot of really neat things that have already happened, and the possibilities, I think, are just gonna be really exciting for our community. So we're gonna talk about the history of Red Oak Park, what fully ADA accessible play structures are all about, and how the Burnsville Lions Club comes into play in this, and then kind of next steps of, based on what's happened in the last month or so, where we're at and where we could be going, so. So Red Oak Park history, it is one of our 22 community parks that we have. This is an old photo, so but as you probably know, we just put in pickleball courts at this location, so these are the old tennis courts and whatnot, but so the park itself has undergone a little bit of a renovation already with the replacement of those, with the tennis courts to be a tennis and pickleball location. We have athletic fields for baseball, softball, and then soccer in this location. The warming house in the winter time for winter skating also serves as a host location for us for our Kids of Summer programs and camp type programs. Not in this picture, but in another part of the park is a separate parking lot that has access to the disc golf course that's at this location. And then we also have the basketball court here. Similar to Cedarbridge, this playground's over 23 years old, and we had funding for replacement of this particular playground in the park's CIP. So that's kind of, each year as we're looking at the different projects that are coming up, we start to evaluate the park and think about what the possibilities could be with the funding that we have available to us. So, as I mentioned earlier, we just redid our Parks and Recreation System Master Plan. And I will tell you that and JJ's a major player in this too, but our department is not about just having done that plan and letting it sit on our shelf somewhere. We are trying to actively live that every day to figure out how we can implement the suggestions and make the improvements provided by our consultant and our community to continue to improve on our park system and how it serves our community. So two of the things that relate to this particular project before you this evening is the request that we provide a fully ADA accessible or inclusive play area somewhere in our community. And that as we are replacing playgrounds, that we consider poured in place, which is, if you're not familiar with that term, it's basically more of a rubberized surface. Currently we use a wood chip type surface that is ADA compliant, but it's certainly not as easy to move around on as a poured in place material that has more of a rubber flat firm surface associated with it. So the value of a fully inclusive playground, I shared in the Cedarbridge presentation, all the values of just a standard traditional playground. And then when you start to look at the value of a fully inclusive playground, you have all those same values, but then you start to add on the fact that it can address the needs of all children, children with autism, hearing impairments, cerebral palsy, spina bifida, other challenges. They may not have as much enjoyment or be able to have the same experience in all of a playground if there are only components or areas that are accessible. But when you start to get into the fully inclusive playgrounds, it really, as the next line says, it really accommodates all ages and skill levels and can challenge them at where they're at that moment in their developmental levels. And then with inclusive playgrounds, you often will see music type play options and light and sensory panels that again provide different experiences for children in different ways that our traditional playgrounds just don't do. So just again, as this concept and opportunity started to grow and whatnot, I looked into the data of inclusive playgrounds, and I know it's 2019 now, but just looking back as early as 2012, there are only 100 inclusive playgrounds in the entire United States, which is kind of amazing a little bit when you think about it, because they are a little more prevalent now. But at the same time, when you start digging into the question, why is that the case, given that they are such a great park feature, it really comes down to cost, and that's the huge barrier. When we look at replacing our community playgrounds, you're looking at that $12 to $16 a square foot area. And as I talked about the poured in place surface material, that's the $16 that gets you the surface. It gets you no equipment, it gets you none of the borders, nothing else. You just get a surface. So you can see right there off of the start, when you're starting to look at these, that the dollar amounts are gonna go up. And then, the rest of it is the equipment piece. To get a foot off the ground on a traditional playground, you need a couple steps. To get a foot off the ground on an inclusive playground, the ramps and the different things associated with that start to go up significantly, and the amount of equipment and things that you need. So that's always the challenge, is how do we create a great playground opportunity for people and yet fit the budgets that we have to work with. So despite all these great benefits, like I said, there just aren't a lot of them, but there have been 4 that have kind of popped up recently in the last few years in the metro area. This one here is in Woodbury, quite a large inclusive playground, north of $800,000 for that particular one. The one in the upper right here is over in Lakeville. I drive by it on a regular basis, and there are always people there. It's just a heavily used park. Whether there's ball games going on or not, it's packed. That one at the time it was built was about $250,000. These bottom 2, one was the design for the Shakopee Lions playground, and then this one to the bottom right was north of $600,000 is the Winona Lions playground. So as we surveyed the 4 different locations, based on the square footage of their parks and whatnot, they averaged about $36 a square foot, which, as I mentioned before, based on what a traditional playground is, you're looking at about 3 times the amount as a base level of what you're looking at, and the more extravagant you go, obviously the higher that can be. So we weren't done there. I have come across it's kind of a unique thing called bank shot basketball, and it's kind of hard to tell what it is here unless you watch a YouTube video on it, and I'd encourage you to check it out. But bank shot's kind of a new thing that it was demonstrated at a National Parks and Recreation conference, and they are starting to pop up around the country. But I would call it, or it has been called, I guess, the mini golf of basketball, essentially. And you can see that the backboards have different shapes and dimensions to them. And then you can see on the surface here, if you can see the cursor, there's like a green and a yellow and a red. And so the way the game is set up is based on the distance that you are from the backboard and whatnot, your shots are worth different points and things like that. So it's really you know, you could go there and play against someone who's played basketball, and I would imagine they could do terribly because you just can't plan for the dimensions and the way it bounces off. And so it's, regardless of age and skill level, trying to figure out how it's gonna bounce and whatnot is not gonna be all that easy. So that was just kind of, and again, as we're looking at, you know, when we're coming through and renovating our parks and have funding to work with, you know, how do we create something unique that you're just not going to go next door to a different park in your community or to your neighboring community and find the same experience. And so this idea has been sitting on my desk for a couple years now, just saying, I don't know how or when, but someday there may be an opportunity where we could try to consider something like this. So given what we were looking at, it just kind of made sense to throw it in the pile as a possibility.
Is there a cost for the bank shot system?
Yes, yep. They have, they kind of sell their systems in preset type processes. So you've got the poured in place surface that you will need associated with this. And then depending on if you go with 9 or 12 or 16, you know, they will provide you with the baskets and the poles and whatnot for the different costs associated with it. It's about $40,000 for kind of just the entry level, getting it all set up and whatnot. So as we are looking at how do we live out our park and rec system master plan, and how do we look at, you know, making it unique and different and bringing a much needed inclusive playground to our community, how do we make something like this happen with a budget that we have to work with? And the answer to that is the Burnsville Lions Club. And pictured here is just, in the last few years, just some examples of how the Lions Club has partnered with the city of Burnsville to make good things that we have in our community great. And for those watching at home, you guys here are nodding and whatnot, but you know, our first big challenge was that I was a part of recently was the replacement of Skyline Playground, and how popular a park that was for us, and the money that we had it just didn't match what we felt the community was looking for, and they stepped up to the table and partnered with us to make that just a playground area that our community still loves and uses a lot these days. And then they came back a couple years later and helped us add the splash pad in there as a phase 2 piece, which is an award-winning top splash pad in the state. When you see surveys come out on the best splash pads in the metro area. And then of course our skate park was a multi-year process, and at the time, and I'm guessing it may still be, they helped us put in the only free amoeba bowl in the state of Minnesota, and so again, go by that park any time of the day, as long as there's not snow on the ground and people are out there using it. So had an opportunity to connect with some of the Lions Club members and share about the hope and dream of Red Oak Park. And I learned last month that they have provided us with $140,000 in donations to go towards the bank shot project and making Red Oak an inclusive playground, and joining with what the dollars were that the city had for this process. So I'm not even sure what I said when they told me the first night, because like I said, it was just the excitement of being able to provide something that I think has been a long time need for our community, and for whatever reasons the resources just haven't been there, and to now know that that could be less than a year away is just a really exciting opportunity. So what I've done since I got the news is I had already been working with Confluence, and I reached out to them, and we've got them on board to help us out with this process. They have worked with some of the other inclusive playgrounds in the area, and then we immediately got a subcommittee formed with city staff that should be a part of that, Burnsville Lions Club members, which absolutely should, and then some of you may know that Gideon Pond just recently put in an inclusive playground on their property. But not only that, since they have experience with it, but just their connection with people, to people that have disabilities in our community, that they may be able to share experiences or give us connections to folks who have a passion for something like this and may be willing to join the committee as well. So we'll be kicking off our first meeting in a few days here, and we'll hope to try to finalize what that committee looks like at that point and help us to move forward to make this a reality. So, questions?
Thanks, Garrett. I can see why you're excited. And many, many thanks to the Burnsville Lions for all they've been doing. Anybody have questions? Comments?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I'm curious about the life expectancy of the poured surfaces. And I'm assuming that there's something that's gonna come with a warranty. And what is, is it a 10-year, 20-year, 30-year warranty? And how well do they, wear?
Correct. So, it's a great question. It's one that we had when we put in, Lions Playground at Cliff End Park, because there is a portion of it that is poured in place. And at that time, so that was, 2013, the life expectancy was about what they considered the park to be, which is about 20 years. And so there are warranties associated with it. And it doesn't mean that they aren't without challenges and there aren't chips and chunks that, but there's ways to patch those and do things if those do come up and whatnot. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
The last item on our list is miscellaneous. Do we have anything, staff?
Just a couple of items, but first I'd like to say the last two items we had were simply informational purposes. And when we have such great things happening in our park system, we definitely want to make note of that, like with the Lions here, like with the neighborhood commitment to their park over by Cedarbridge. So those two items were just for informational purposes only. No formal action was required on your part. But with the miscellaneous items, our next meeting is going to be on Monday, May 6th. And then I also put in your notes that the pickleball court grand opening is scheduled for May 30th. That will be another opportunity for you folks to come out and maybe help promote not just the pickleball courts, but all the parks in our community. And so more information will follow on that. Amber Jacobson, one of the staff members in the recreation office, she's the one working on that grand opening. So she'll give us more information as she has it available. But hopefully that'll be an opportunity for you guys to get out into the community and, again, tell people about our park system. So that's great.
Okay, thanks, JJ. Can I get a motion for adjournment?
All right.
Second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Good night, and thanks for joining us for the Parks and Natural Resource Commission meeting.